Cold coin hitting a wooden table sounds exactly like a life ending. He dumped the heavy leather sack onto the scarred oak, buying a queen to save a rotting kingdom. She watched the gold spill, knowing she was nothing more than a transaction, a warm body for a freezing pack, a dowry to buy grain. He thought he had purchased a meek, terrified pawn to sit quietly in the shadows. He was dead wrong. Rain lashed against the leaded glass of Lord Croft's study, drowning out the murmurs of the servants in the halls below. Rowena stood perfectly still by the hearth. The fire had burned down to white ash and glowing embers, offering no real warmth. She kept her chin tipped upward, her hands clasped loosely in front of her grey wool dress. She would not shiver. She would not give them the satisfaction. Across the room, her father counted the heavy silver pieces. His fingers, stained with ink and smelling perpetually of sour wine, moved with a greedy, frantic rhythm. Standing opposite the desk was Graham Ward. He did not look like a king. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found the temperature lacking. He wore boiled leather and a heavy wolf pelt cloak that dragged on the stone floor, dark with rainwater and mud. His jaw was covered in a rough, uneven scruff of dark hair. When he shifted his weight, the floorboards groaned under his heavy boots. He smelled of wet earth, iron, and a raw, feral musk that made the hairs on Rowena's arms stand up. 300 pieces of silver, Lord Croft muttered, sweeping the last of the coins into a velvet pouch. And the deed to the Lower Valley grain stores. As agreed. As agreed, Graham said. His voice was a low rumble. It didn't resonate in the room, it resonated in the chest. She is yours, Alpha, Croft said, not bothering to look at his daughter. Take her before the roads freeze over entirely. I wash my hands of her. Rowena felt a hard, tight knot form in her throat. She swallowed it down. 18 years of running this estate, balancing the ledgers, keeping the creditors at bay, while her father drank his grief into the bottom of a glass. And this was her reward. Sold to a savage from the northern peaks to settle a debt and secure a border. Graham finally turned to look at her. His eyes were a startling, washed-out amber. They were not human eyes. They were flat, calculating, and utterly predatory. He didn't look at her with lust. He looked at her the way a man inspects a new plough or a heavy winter coat. She was a tool, an asset. Pack your things, Graham told her. They are already packed, Rowena replied. Her voice was steady. She gestured to the single leather satchel sitting by the door. Graham's brow twitched. A fractional movement. That is all you own. That is all I need, she said. She walked past her father without a second glance, picking up the satchel. It was heavy with medicinal texts, a few changes of sturdy clothing, and her mother's hunting knife. She didn't pack silk. There was no use for silk where she was going. We ride in 10 minutes, Graham said, turning on his heel. He didn't offer to carry her bag. She didn't expect him to. The courtyard was a muddy swamp. A dozen heavily armed men waited on horseback, their cloaks pulled tight against the driving rain. They were massive men, broad-shouldered and grim, with eyes that tracked her every movement. Wolves. The rumors in the southern valleys spoke of the northern packs as mindless beasts, tearing each other apart for scraps of meat. But these men sat in disciplined silence. Graham mounted a massive black gelding. He looked down at her. You'll ride with Fen, Graham ordered, nodding toward a scarred man with a missing ear who sat atop a roan mare. I prefer to ride my own mount, Rowena said, planting her boots in the mud. Fen let out a harsh bark of laughter. The princess wants a pony. Graham didn't laugh. He stared at her through the rain. My pack is starving, lady. My kingdom is eating its own boots. We didn't bring a spare horse because we had to eat the last one 3 weeks ago. You ride with Fen or you walk. Rowena looked at the scarred man, then back at Graham. The cynical shell she had built around herself cracked just a fraction, letting in a cold draft of reality. He wasn't exaggerating. the hollowness in his cheeks, the sharp angles of his men's faces. They were running on fumes. She was bought with the last of their wealth. Without another word, Rowena walked over to Fenn's horse. She grabbed the saddle horn and hauled herself up behind him, ignoring the wet mud soaking through her skirt. "Hold on tight, southern girl," Fenn muttered. "The king sets a punishing pace." "I can keep up," Rowena said, wrapping her hands loosely around the back of his saddle, refusing to touch him more than necessary. Graham spurred his horse forward. The heavy wooden gates of the Croft estate swung open, and they rode out into the gathering storm. Rowena didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in the warm, comfortable south. Her life was now tied to a starving king and a kingdom of ice. Mud froze solid beneath the horses' hooves as they climbed higher into the crags. The transition from the wet, dreary southern autumn to the brutal, unforgiving northern winter took less than 2 days. By the third afternoon, the snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. Rowena was numb. Her leather boots were thoroughly soaked, the moisture turning to ice against her toes. She kept her face pressed against the rough wool of Fenn's cloak, stealing whatever body heat the werewolf radiated. He was abnormally warm, like a living furnace, which was the only reason she hadn't succumbed to frostbite. They rode in absolute silence. The wolves didn't complain. They endured. Graham led the column, taking the brunt of the wind. He hadn't spoken to her since the courtyard. He didn't check to see if she was alive, freezing, or crying. He treated her exactly as she expected, like cargo. As twilight began to bleed the light from the sky, Graham suddenly raised a fist. The column halted instantly. Rowena lifted her head, blinking snow from her eyelashes. The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, but beneath the gale she heard something else. A low, vibrating growl. It didn't come from Graham's men. It came from the tree line. "Rogues!" Fenn hissed, his hand dropping to the heavy broadsword at his hip, drawn by the smell of human. He meant her. "Dismount!" Fenn ordered, shoving her roughly by the shoulder. Rowena didn't argue. She slid off the horse, her numb legs giving out for a second before she caught herself against a frozen boulder. She drew her mother's hunting knife from her belt. It was a pathetic weapon against a werewolf, but she refused to die with empty hands. Shadows detached themselves from the snow-heavy pines. 5 of them. They were massive, emaciated wolves with matted fur and crazed yellow eyes. Saliva dripped from their jaws, freezing as it hit the ground. They were starving, driven mad by the cold and hunger. Graham didn't draw a sword. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the snow. He walked toward the lead rogue, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Hold the line," Graham ordered his men. His voice was dead calm. The largest rogue lunged. Graham didn't just meet the attack, he exploded. The transformation was instantaneous and violently loud. Bones cracked and reformed with sickening pops. Muscles tore and stitched together in a fraction of a second. Where a man stood, a monster took his place. Rowena gasped, pressing her back against the freezing stone. Graham's wolf form was terrifying. He was a nightmare of midnight fur and corded muscle, standing a full head taller than the rogue. He met the attacker mid-air. The sound of jaws snapping shut on bone echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Graham tore the rogue's throat out before it even hit the ground. Blood sprayed across the white snow in a hot, steaming arc. The other 4 attacked simultaneously. Rowena watched in morbid fascination. She had read about the savagery of the northern shifters, but words on parchment didn't capture the sheer, brutal efficiency of it. Graham was a machine of death. He didn't fight with honor or technique. He fought to kill. He crushed a skull under his massive paws. He snapped a spine with a vicious shake of his heavy head. Fenn and the others stayed mounted, holding the frightened horses steady. They didn't interfere. This was their king's duty. In less than a minute, it was over. 5 mangled carcasses lay steaming in the snow. Graham stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his muzzle dripping with dark blood. He turned his massive, wolfish head toward Rowena. His amber eyes locked onto hers. The beast was right there on the surface, practically humming with residual adrenaline and violence. Rowena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She didn't scream. She didn't shrink away. She sheathed her knife with a sharp click. Slowly, Graham shifted back. The sickening crunch of bones echoed again, and he was a man once more, kneeling in the bloody snow. He was entirely naked, his back scarred with old wounds and fresh claw marks. Fen tossed him a bundle of clothes. Graham dressed methodically, ignoring the cold. When he finished, he walked over to where Rowena stood. He wiped a smear of blood from his jaw, leaving a streak of crimson across his pale skin. "You didn't run," Graham stated. It wasn't a question. "Where would I run?" Rowena asked, her voice raspy from the cold. "Into the woods to freeze? Or back down the mountain to a father who sold me?" Graham studied her face. He was looking for a crack, for the hysterical weeping he clearly expected from a pampered southern lady. He found nothing but grim pragmatism. Rowena reached into her satchel and pulled out a clean strip of linen. She held it out to him. "You missed a spot." Graham looked at the cloth, then at her. He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned down, bringing his face inches from hers. He smelled intensely of fresh blood and wet earth. "This is what I am," Graham said quietly. "This is what my people are. We are killers. We are starving. You think your ledgers and your southern manners will matter up here?" "I think starving men still need to eat," Rowena replied evenly. "And my dowry bought you grain. So you can either stand here trying to frighten me, or we can get moving before we all freeze to death." A heavy silence fell between them. Fen chuckled under his breath from his horse. Graham took the linen cloth from her hand. He wiped the blood from his neck, his eyes never leaving hers. For the first time since they met, something shifted in his expression. The utter indifference was gone. In its place was a flicker of genuine curiosity. "Mount up!" Graham ordered the men, turning away from her. Rowena climbed back onto Fen's horse, her hand shaking slightly now that the danger had passed. But as the column moved forward into the dark, she realized something crucial. Graham Ward wasn't just a monster. He was a desperate leader. And desperate leaders made mistakes. If she wanted to survive his world, she couldn't just endure it. She had to manage it. Dirholm loomed against the jagged mountains like a forgotten tombstone. It was a fortress of dark basalt, built into the very cliffside to shield it from the worst of the northern gales. As they rode through the heavy iron gates, Rowena took stock of her new home. It was dying. The courtyard was filled with packed, dirty snow. Emaciated men and women huddled around meager fires built in rusted iron braziers. Their clothes were patched and worn thin. Children with hollow cheeks stopped what they were doing to stare at the riders. There was no cheering, no welcome for their king. Only silent, desperate eyes, tracking the saddlebags, looking for food. Rowena's stomach tightened. Her father had said the northern packs were struggling. But this was a famine. Graham dismounted in the center of the courtyard. A few of the pack members stepped forward, bowing their heads respectfully, but keeping their distance. A woman strode out from the heavy oak doors of the main keep. She was tall, with stark white hair, braided tight against her scalp, and a long, jagged scar running down the left side of her face. She wore heavy furs and an expression of pure iron. "You return, Alpha," she said. Her eyes flicked immediately to Rowena, who was sliding down from Fen's horse. "And you brought a pet." "This is Rowena Croft," Graham said, his voice carrying over the wind. "She is the new queen of Dirholm." A collective murmur rippled through the courtyard. It wasn't a happy sound. It was confusion laced with resentment. "A human?" the scarred woman asked, stepping closer to inspect Rowena. "You traded our last gold reserves for a human girl?" "We need meat, Graham. We need swords, not a fragile thing that will freeze before the solstice. "Watch your tone, Vanya," Graham warned softly. The rumble in his chest was back. "I will not," Vanya snapped. "The grain wagons you promised haven't arrived. The southern passes are blocked by snow, and you bring back a useless mouth to feed. The pack is starving." Graham took a step toward her, his eyes flashing amber. The air in the courtyard instantly grew heavy, thick with the threat of violence. The wolves around the fires shrank back. "Stop!" Rowena's voice cut through the tension. It wasn't a shout, but it carried a sharp, authoritative edge that made both Graham and Vanya turn to look at her. Rowena ignored Graham's warning glare and walked straight up to Vanya. She was shorter than the scarred wolf by a good 6 inches, but she didn't tilt her chin up to compensate. She held her ground. "The grain wagons are delayed because they took the lower river road, knowing the mountain passes would be blocked by the early snow," Rowena stated calmly. "They will arrive at the eastern postern gate in 2 days. I charted the route myself before we left." Vanya narrowed her eyes. "You?" "Yes, me," Rowena said. She pulled her heavy satchel off her shoulder and let it drop onto a wooden crate nearby. She popped the buckles and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She shoved it into Vanya's chest. "What is this?" Vanya demanded. "That is a full inventory of the supplies I secured," Rowena said. 500 bushels of winter wheat, 2 tons of salted pork, 30 barrels of ale, medical supplies, blankets. The gold wasn't just for me. It was for the logistics to get it here." The courtyard went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Graham stared at her. He had read the treaty, of course. He knew what he bought. But seeing her stand in the freezing mud, lecturing his fiercest enforcer with a ledger, was something he clearly hadn't anticipated. "Now," Rowena continued, turning to scan the miserable faces in the courtyard, "I want a full accounting of your stores. Show me your kitchens, your medical ward, and your armory. We need to ration what you currently have, so the transition to the new supplies is seamless. And someone fetch me a hot cup of tea. It's freezing out here." Nobody moved. They all looked at Graham, waiting for his command, waiting for him to put this arrogant human in her place. Graham looked at Rowena. She met his gaze, raising a single, expectant eyebrow. She was testing him, setting the boundary right here, right now. If he humiliated her, she would never have the pack's respect, and she wouldn't be able to fix his broken kingdom. A slow, rough sound escaped Graham's throat. It took a moment for Rowena to realize it was a laugh, dark and humorless. But a laugh nonetheless. "You heard the Queen," Graham said, his voice ringing across the stones. "Show her the kitchens, and fetch her some damn tea." Vanya glared at Rowena for a long second before giving a stiff nod. "Follow me, Your Grace." Rowena picked up her satchel and followed the scarred woman into the keep. She didn't look back at Graham. She had won the first battle. But as the heavy oak doors shut behind her, plunging her into the damp, freezing corridors of Direholm, she knew the war had only just begun. She had to keep these monsters alive through the winter, and she had to figure out what to do about the Alpha King, who was watching her with entirely too much interest. Dust danced in the pale shafts of light piercing the armory windows. Rowena wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, her fingers leaving a dark streak across her freezing skin. She flipped to a fresh page in her ledger, the scratch of her charcoal pencil, the only sound in the cavernous room. The armory was a joke. Rusted broadswords lay discarded in corners. Pikes featured splintered shafts. She found a few decent yew-bows, but nowhere near enough arrows to supply a standard defense. Vanya leaned against the stone archway, arms crossed over her heavy leather tunic. She watched Rowena with a mixture of naked hostility and begrudging curiosity. 4 dozen usable blades, Rowena said, her voice echoing off the damp, vaulted ceiling. And maybe 20 wooden shields that won't splinter on the first heavy strike. You are fighting a border war with scrap metal. We fight with claws, Vanya growled, pushing off the wall to step into the room. Steel is a luxury for weak southern men. We rely on the beast. The beast cannot deflect a volley of iron-tipped arrows, Rowena replied smoothly, not looking up from her pages. And the beast requires massive amounts of calories to heal from severe wounds, calories you simply do not have. Arrogance will not fill your bellies, Vanya. It will only fill your graveyard. Vanya's upper lip curled, exposing a flash of elongated canines. A low, vibrating hum started in her throat. It was a warning, a command to submit. Rowena closed the ledger with a sharp, resounding snap. She turned to fully face the towering werewolf. Her heart battered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but she kept her breathing perfectly even. She anchored her boots to the floor. "You can try to intimidate me," Rowena said, her tone conversational, "but it is a waste of energy you cannot afford to burn. If you kill me, the caravans I organized turn back. My death warrant is your starvation. So unless you plan to eat these rusted swords, I suggest you help me count the chainmail." A deep, rumbling chuckle broke the tension. Graham stepped out from the shadows of the stairwell. He moved with a terrifying silence for a man of his size. He had changed out of his muddy riding leathers into a simple, dark spun tunic and thick trousers. But the raw, violent energy of the wolf still clung to him like a second skin. He walked past Vanya, giving his enforcer a look that instantly silenced her growl. "She is entirely right, Vanya," Graham said, his amber eyes fixing on Rowena. "Arrogance won't feed us, and clearly our new queen is not burdened by fear." "I am terrified," Rowena corrected him flatly. "I am standing in a freezing stone room with monsters who could snap my spine in 3 seconds. But fear is not productive. Counting the chainmail is—" Graham paused. He tilted his head, studying her. The scent of her fear was obvious to him. It smelled like crushed mint and sharp copper beneath the heavy wool of her dress. But her heartbeat was steadying. She was terrified, yet she refused to let the terror pilot her actions. He had seen seasoned warlords break down weeping in these dungeons. This human girl was merely annoyed by the rust. "Leave us," Graham ordered without looking away from Rowena. Vanya bowed her head stiffly. "Yes, Alpha." Her heavy boots retreated up the stone steps, leaving them entirely alone in the gloom. Graham walked slowly toward the center table, where Rowena had set up her makeshift workspace. He picked up a rusted dagger, testing the dull edge against his thumb. "My father," Graham began, his voice low and scraping, "ruled this pack with absolute brutality. He believed that to show hunger was to show weakness. When the southern trade routes closed, he refused to negotiate. He let our people eat bark and old leather, rather than bend the knee to the human kings below the mountains." He tossed the dagger back onto the table. The clatter rang sharply. "I killed him for it," Graham said. Rowena stopped writing. She looked up. Graham wasn't boasting. He stated the fact with the same clinical detachment she used to inventory the rotten grain. "I tore out his throat in the main courtyard," Graham continued, stepping closer to her. "I took his crown, and I took his failing kingdom. I sold the last of our ancestral gold, swallowed my pride, and went to your father begging for a trade agreement. I bought a human bride because the treaty demanded collateral." He stopped just a foot away from her. The sheer heat radiating off his body cut through the freezing draft of the room. "I expected a weeping child," Graham murmured, looking down at her ink-stained fingers. "I expected a soft thing I would have to lock in a tower to keep the pack from tearing apart. Instead, you walk into my home, insult my enforcer, and take command of my dying keep." He leaned in, his nose inches from her temple. She felt his breath stir her hair. "Who are you?" Rowena Croft. Rowena didn't shrink back. She met his gaze. The amber depths of his eyes were startlingly beautiful up close, a stark contrast to the violence they promised. "I am the woman who kept my father's estate from collapsing when he drank away his grief," she said, her voice steady. "I am the woman who balanced the books, paid the soldiers, and kept the southern creditors from burning our crops. I am not a weeping child, Graham. I am a survivor. Just like you." Graham stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The wolf in him demanded submission. The king in him recognized an equal. Slowly he reached out. His large, calloused hand brushed against her freezing cheek. The touch was shockingly gentle. Rowena stiffened, her breath catching in her throat, but she didn't pull away. "Your hands are freezing," Graham said quietly. "It is winter," Rowena replied, trying to ignore the sudden, electric warmth blooming where his skin met hers. "Come," Graham said, stepping back and breaking the contact. The sudden absence of his heat left her shivering. "The kitchens have managed to boil some broth. You will eat, Queen. I cannot have my quartermaster starving to death." Rowena picked up her ledger. She tucked her charcoal pencil behind her ear. "Lead the way, Alpha." Heavy wooden wheels groaned against the frozen earth. The sound echoed through the eastern pass, bouncing off the sheer cliff faces before rolling over the walls of Deerholm. Rowena stood on the freezing battlements, her hands wrapped tight in heavy wool mittens. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face, but she ignored it, her eyes fixed on the narrow mountain road. Beside her stood Tobias Fenn, the scarred enforcer she had ridden with. He held a heavy spyglass to his remaining eye. "Well?" Rowena asked, her voice tight. Fenn lowered the glass. A strange, unfamiliar expression stretched across his ruined face. It took Rowena a second to realize it was a smile. "4 wagons," Fenn breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Heavy, ox-drawn. They fly the Croft banner." A collective gasp swept through the sentries stationed along the wall. The word spread like wildfire. Before the wagons had even reached the heavy iron gates, the courtyard below was swarming with pack members. They didn't cheer. They stood in stunned, desperate silence, watching the massive wooden doors swing open. Rowena hurried down the stone steps, Fenn a heavy shadow at her back. When she reached the courtyard, Graham was already there. He stood at the front of his people, his broad shoulders tense as the first wagon rolled into the keep. The driver, a bundled human mercenary from the south, pulled hard on the reins. "Delivery for King Ward," the driver shouted, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Courtesy of the new queen." Graham didn't look at the driver. He turned and found Rowena in the crowd. The pack parted for her instantly, their eyes tracking her every movement. 3 days ago, they had looked at her with resentment. Now, they looked at her with raw, desperate reverence. Rowena walked past Graham and approached the lead wagon. She pulled a heavy iron key from her cloak and unlocked the massive wooden padlock securing the canvas tarp. She threw the tarp back. Sacks of winter wheat, barrels of salted pork, crates of dried apples, root vegetables, and thick wheels of hard cheese. A ragged sob broke the silence. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands. "Vanya!" Rowena barked, her voice snapping the courtyard out of its trance. The scarred woman pushed through the crowd. "Yes, Your Grace." The title wasn't spoken with venom this time. It was an acknowledgement. "Organize a detail. Get these supplies into the dry cellars immediately. I want the kitchens firing every hearth they have. We start with a thin stew, pork fat, root vegetables, and a handful of grain. Do not let them gorge themselves on solid meat yet, or their stomachs will reject it. We feed the children and the elderly first. Then the sentries, then the rest of the pack. It will be done," Vanya said. She turned to the crowd, barking orders in the harsh, guttural tongue of the northern wolves. The courtyard exploded into organized chaos. For the first time since Rowena had arrived, Deerholm felt alive. The crushing, suffocating silence of starvation was replaced by the frantic, hopeful energy of survival. Rowena stood by the wagons for 3 hours, checking every sack and barrel off her ledger as they were unloaded. She didn't stop moving. She didn't let herself feel the biting cold seeping through the soles of her boots. She commanded, she organized, and she fought the logistics war with ruthless efficiency. By the time the final crate of medical supplies was carried into the keep, the sun had dipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the courtyard into a deep, freezing twilight. Rowena closed her ledger. The exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled slightly, her vision swimming for a fraction of a second. A heavy, warm hand wrapped around her elbow, catching her before she could stumble. "You're done for the day," Graham said. Rowena blinked, looking up at him. He was covered in flour dust from helping carry sacks of wheat into the cellars. The terrifying Alpha King, hauling grain like a common laborer. "I need to supervise the kitchen rations," Rowena argued weakly, trying to pull her arm away. "If they overeat, they will become violently ill." "Vanya understands," Graham interrupted, pulling her firmly to his side. His body heat was a sudden, glorious shock to her freezing system. "She is standing guard in the kitchens. Anyone who takes more than their allotted ration loses a finger. They will not overeat." Rowena sighed, the fight draining out of her. "Barbaric. Effective," Graham countered. He didn't let go of her arm. Instead, he led her away from the bustling courtyard toward the heavy wooden doors of the Alpha's private quarters in the high tower. Rowena was too tired to protest. Every muscle in her body ached. Graham pushed open the heavy oak door. The room was surprisingly warm. A massive fire roared in the stone hearth. The space was sparse, utilitarian, but it lacked the damp, rotting feel of the rest of the keep. A heavy fur rug lay before the fire, and a small wooden table was set with 2 iron bowls. The smell hit Rowena immediately. Real, hot food. Graham guided her to a heavy wooden chair and pushed her down into it. He walked over to the fire, lifted a blackened iron pot from the hook, and ladled a generous portion of steaming stew into her bowl. He set it down in front of her, along with a thick slice of coarse bread. "Eat," Graham commanded, sitting down opposite her. Rowena stared at the bowl. It was mostly broth and root vegetables, with a few precious scraps of salted pork. It was the best thing she had ever smelled in her life. She picked up the wooden spoon and took a bite. The hot liquid burned its way down her throat, thawing the ice that had settled in her chest over the last week. She closed her eyes, letting out a small, involuntary sigh of pure relief. When she opened her eyes, Graham was watching her. He hadn't touched his own food. "Why aren't you eating?" Rowena asked, pointing her spoon at him. "I am watching a southern human save my pack," Graham said quietly. "It is a sight I never thought I would witness." Rowena lowered her spoon. "I am just honoring a contract, Graham. My father's debts are paid. Your border is secure. The transaction is complete." Graham leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The firelight cast deep, flickering shadows across the sharp planes of his face. The beast in his amber eyes was completely still, completely focused on her. "A transaction secures wheat, Rowena," Graham said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "It does not stand in the freezing mud for hours to ensure the weakest are fed first. You are trying to pretend you have ice in your veins to survive this place." He reached across the table, his warm, rough fingers gently wrapping over her wrist. "But you care. You actually care about them." Rowena looked down at his hand on hers. The cynical armor she wore every single day felt heavy, cracking under the intense heat of his gaze. She had spent 18 years burying her heart to protect her father's crumbling legacy. She wasn't supposed to care about the monsters of the North. She was just supposed to survive them. "If they die," Rowena whispered, pulling her hand back slowly. "Who is going to count the chainmail?" Graham smiled. It wasn't a smirk or a threat. It was a genuine, devastatingly handsome smile that fundamentally altered his face. making him look less like a king and more like a man. "Eat your stew, Queen," Graham said softly. The real winter is just beginning. Snow buried the lower passes completely by the first week of December, sealing Derholm in a fortress of white ice and black rock. The keep was no longer dying, but it was far from thriving. The rations kept the hunger pangs at bay, yet the cold still crept through the drafty stone corridors, testing the limits of werewolf endurance and human resilience alike. Rowena adapted. She discarded her southern wools for heavy pelts and lined leathers, tailoring them herself by the light of a single tallow candle. She learned the names of the pack. She learned that the blacksmith, a gruff giant named Kale, had lost 2 sons to the famine. She learned that the young sentries preferred night watches because the moon gave them a slight edge in body heat. She stopped being the southern collateral and slowly, quietly, became the architect of their survival. Vanya no longer looked at her with venom. Instead, the scarred enforcer shadowed Rowena's movements through the keep, acting as a silent, imposing bodyguard. Tobias Fenn had taken to leaving a fresh cup of hot pine needle tea on her ledger every morning. It was a brutal, ugly world, but the loyalty of these monsters, once earned, was absolute. Graham remained an enigma of violence and quiet observation. He spent his days drilling the sentries in the courtyard, brutalizing his men in the freezing mud until their reflexes were razor-sharp. He pushed them past exhaustion, preparing for a war Rowena couldn't quite see. She saw it on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. The heavy iron horn atop the northern watchtower blared a harsh, 2-note warning. Rowena was in the cellars, cataloguing a slight rot in a barrel of winter apples when the sound vibrated through the stone floor. Vanya drew her broadsword instantly, the metal hissing against the leather scabbard. "Stay here," Vanya ordered. "I am the quartermaster of this keep, and if someone is here to take my inventory, I will be looking them in the eye," Rowena replied. She bypassed the towering werewolf and marched up the winding stone stairs. When she reached the courtyard, the air was thick with tension. A dozen of Graham's best fighters, including Fenn, formed a loose half-circle near the main gates. Their hands rested on pommels. Their jaws were tight. In the center of the yard stood Graham, his heavy pelt cloak blowing in the bitter wind. Facing him were 5 strangers on horseback. They were wolves, but they looked nothing like the haggard, lean fighters of Derholm. They were massive, thick with muscle and heavy winter fat. They wore polished steel chainmail and cloaks of pristine white fox fur. They reeked of excess. The leader swung down from his horse. He had a broad, cruel face and pale blue eyes that scanned the miserable courtyard with utter disdain. "Kalen," Graham said. His voice was a flat, dead calm that made the hair on Rowena's arms stand up. "Graham?" Kalen replied, stepping forward. He didn't bow. He barely nodded. I heard a rumor that the starving king of the crags suddenly found himself a full larder. I see the sentries have a little meat back on their bones. "What do you want, Kalen?" "I am a neighbor. I came to check on you," Kalen mocked, walking in a slow circle. He stopped when he saw Rowena standing near the keep's entrance. His pale eyes snapped onto her, raking over her form. "And I hear you bought a pet, a human girl to warm your bed in exchange for southern scraps." A low, collective growl rippled through Graham's men. Vanya stepped in front of Rowena, a living wall of muscle and scars. Kalen laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "Careful, Graham. Your mutts are getting loud. I merely came to offer a proposition. My pack controls the eastern hunting grounds. You have grain. We have fresh meat. We are willing to trade. 10 bushels of wheat for a single elk." Rowena's mind worked frantically. 10 bushels of wheat could sustain 20 people for a month. A single elk, while nutrient-dense, would be consumed by this pack in 3 days. It was an extortionate rate. It was a siege tactic disguised as a bargain. "We decline," Graham said smoothly. Do not be hasty, Kalen warned, his smile dropping. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from tense to explosive. The snows are deep, rogues are starving. It would be a tragedy if your grain silos were to catch fire in the night. Accidents happen to weakened packs. Graham didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He took a single, deliberate step toward the rival Alpha. You threaten my walls? Graham asked softly. Rowena knew what was about to happen. Graham was going to tear this man apart. It was the only response a werewolf king could give to a direct threat. But if Graham killed an Alpha envoy, Kalen's entire pack would descend on Deerholm. They had the weapons. They had the numbers. Deerholm would win the skirmish and lose the war. Alpha Kalen? Rowena's voice rang out, sharp and clear. Graham paused. Kalen looked past him, his brow furrowing in confusion. Rowena stepped around Vanya. She walked right into the center of the courtyard, placing herself strategically between Graham and the heavily armed envoy. She didn't look at Graham. She fixed her gaze entirely on Kalen. There will be no trade, Rowena stated, and there will be no fires. Kalen scoffed. You let the human speak for you, Graham? I speak for the ledger, Rowena cut in smoothly, her tone perfectly conversational. The grain you wish to extort was purchased with Croft silver. My father's silver. The treaty securing these goods was ratified by the southern magistrates. You are well aware of human military doctrine, I assume? Kalen narrowed his eyes. What of it? Human armies do not fight in the snow. They fight with blockades. Rowena lied flawlessly. Her voice never wavered. The magistrate has stationed a garrison of 300 heavy infantry at the base of the lower pass. They are there to ensure their investment in Deerholm yields a return. If our silos burn, the garrison has orders to choke the eastern river route, your primary trade line for iron. You starve us of grain, we starve you of steel. Complete silence fell over the courtyard. There was no garrison. Rowena's father hadn't even paid for a single mercenary escort. The wagons were driven by desperate men looking for quick coin. But Kalen didn't know that. He only knew that humans were heavily armed, highly organized, and notoriously vindictive. Kalen looked at her, searching for the bluff. Rowena stared back, her expression a mask of bored or aristocratic certainty. She had faced down debt collectors who were far scarier than this overgrown dog. Kalen's jaw tightened. He looked at Graham. You hide behind a human treaty. I leverage my assets, Graham corrected. The ghost of a smirk played on his lips. You have your answer, Kalen. Ride out, before the gates close, and I decide I want a new fox fur cloak. The threat was clear. Kalen weighed the odds, spat a mouthful of saliva into the snow, and turned back to his horse. He mounted up, his men following suit. Winter is long, Graham, Kalen threw over his shoulder. Treaties don't keep you warm. They keep me fed, Graham replied. The heavy iron gates swung open, and the 5 riders disappeared into the howling wind. Rowena stood perfectly still until the heavy wooden crossbeam was dropped back into place, securing the gates. Only then did she let out a long, shaky breath, her knees suddenly feeling like water. Before she could stumble, Graham was there. His hand gripped her shoulder, steadying her. A garrison of 300 heavy infantry, Graham asked, his voice a low rumble just for her ears. 300 sounds more intimidating than 50, Rowena whispered back, staring at the snow. Graham let out a rough bark of laughter. He looked at Vanya. Did you hear that? The Queen commands an invisible army. Vanya pounded a massive fist against her breastplate in a salute. Long live the Queen! Midnight wrapped Deerholm in a suffocating darkness, broken only by the flickering hearths scattered throughout the keep. Rowena sat at her wooden desk in her small chamber, staring blankly at the numbers in her ledger. The adrenaline of the afternoon had long since burned off, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. Her lie had bought them time, But time was a fragile currency. Kalen would eventually send scouts down the mountain. When he realized the pass was empty, he would return with an army. Direholm needed weapons. They needed able bodies. Most of all, they needed an alliance. A heavy knock rattled her door. "Enter," she called out, rubbing her tired eyes. The door creaked open. Graham stepped inside. He had shed his heavy pelts and wore only loose canvas trousers and a thin linen shirt, entirely unsuited for the freezing temperature of the stone keep. He looked drained. The sharp, predatory edge he carried in the courtyard was gone, replaced by a heavy, grinding fatigue. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the small hearth, grabbed an iron poker, and stirred the dying embers until they flared back to life. He tossed a fresh log onto the grate. Rowena watched him. In the month she had been here, she had seen him fight, command, and intimidate. She had never seen him look tired. "You should be resting, Alpha," Rowena said quietly. "Training starts at dawn." Graham leaned against the stone mantel, staring into the flames. "Kalen will figure it out. By January, he'll know you bluffed. He'll march on Direholm to take the grain by force. He knows we are still too weak to survive a prolonged siege." "Then we make sure we aren't weak by January," Rowena replied, dipping her quill into the inkwell, though she had nothing left to write. "Steel takes time. Muscle takes time." Graham turned his head to look at her. The shadows deepened the hollows of his cheeks. "I was prepared to rip his throat out today. I was prepared to start a war we couldn't win because my pride demanded it. You stopped me." "You would have died," Rowena said. She kept her voice even, hiding the sudden tightness in her chest at the thought of it. "I have been preparing to die for this pack since I took the crown," Graham said softly. He walked slowly across the room, stopping at the edge of her desk. "That is the duty of the Alpha. You bleed so the pack survives. But today I realized I wasn't just angry that he threatened my walls. I was angry because he looked at you." Rowena's breath hitched. She placed the quill down carefully, suddenly hyper-aware of the small space between them. The scent of him, wood smoke, pine, and that deep, wild musk, filled the room. "I am a political asset, Graham," she murmured, reciting the lie she used to protect herself. "An insult to me is an insult to your authority." Your reaction was tactical. Graham reached out. His fingers brushed the ink smudge on her jawline. His touch was rough, calloused from years of gripping a sword, but the movement was devastatingly gentle. "Do not lie to me, Rowena," he whispered. "You lie to envoys. You lie to creditors. You do not lie to me." He stepped closer, moving into her space. Rowena tilted her head up. She was trapped between her heavy oak desk and the sheer gravity of the Alpha King. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I spent 18 years surviving by feeling nothing," Rowena confessed, the cynical armor finally cracking under the weight of his stare. If I let myself care about this place, about you, it becomes a weakness Kalen can exploit. I have to be the ledger. Cold. Exact." Graham shook his head slowly. He traced the line of her cheek, his thumb resting against the frantic pulse at her throat. The ledger didn't stand between a pack of starving wolves and an armed envoy today, Graham said. A queen did. "You think your heart makes you weak? Your heart is the only reason we are still breathing." He didn't ask for permission. He didn't issue a command. Graham leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of smoke, exhaustion, and the terrifying, fragile hope of survival. Rowena gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing the front of his linen shirt. She intended to push him away, to maintain the professional distance that kept her sane, but her body betrayed her. Instead of pushing, her fingers curled tightly into the fabric, pulling him closer. Graham let out a low, vibrating growl against her lips. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her effortlessly from the chair. He held her against his chest, anchoring her in the storm. For the first time in her life, Rowena wasn't the one carrying the weight of the world. He was carrying it for her. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Graham rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, his expression unguarded and entirely human. "Let them come in January," Graham murmured, his voice a rough scrape against the quiet room. "Let Kaelan march on my walls. He has no idea what he is fighting." Rowena opened her eyes, looking at the bruised, exhausted face of the monster she had been sold to. He wasn't a transaction anymore. He was hers. "No," Rowena agreed, her voice steady and laced with newfound steel. "He doesn't." January arrived with a cruelty that snapped pine branches in the dead of night, sounding like cannon fire echoing across the jagged peaks. Kaelan did not wait for the spring thaw. He came on the 22nd day of the new year, exactly as Graham had predicted, bringing 80 seasoned warriors down the eastern ridge. Rowena stood on the high battlements, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. She held Fenn's heavy brass spyglass to her eye. Through the scratched lens, she watched Kaelan's vanguard advance through the deep powder. They were confident. They moved in a loose, arrogant formation, expecting to find a starving keep manned by walking corpses. They were walking into a meat grinder. "Distance?" Graham asked. He stood beside her, clad in boiled leather and thick chainmail. He carried no shield. A massive broadsword rested casually against his shoulder. 600 yards, Rowena replied, lowering the glass. She handed it to Fenn, who tucked it into his heavy cloak. "They are bypassing the lower switchback. They think the snow is packed enough to support a direct charge on the main gates." "Fools," Fenn grunted. "That drift hides a 30-foot drop into the ravine. We don't rely on the terrain to do our killing," Graham said. His voice was a calm, low hum of suppressed violence. "Terrain is unpredictable. We rely on the math." He looked at Rowena. "Are the choke points ready?" "The oil is boiling in the gatehouse cauldrons," Rowena stated, checking off a mental list. Kael reinforced the inner portcullis with scrap iron from the rusted armory stock. If they breach the outer oak doors, they will be trapped in the murder hole. I've positioned archers on the flanking towers. We only have 60 arrows left, so they are ordered to shoot for the knees. A wounded wolf requires 2 others to drag him off the field. It cuts their numbers faster than a clean kill. Fenn stared at her. The ruined half of his face twitched. "Remind me never to play cards with you, Queen." Rowena didn't smile. Her stomach twisted into tight, agonizing knots, but she forced her hands to remain perfectly still at her sides. She was not a warrior. She had never seen a battlefield, but she understood efficiency. She understood how to maximize a limited inventory, whether that inventory was winter wheat or human lives. A harsh, rhythmic chanting began to drift across the frozen expanse. Kaelan's men were beating their heavy swords against their wooden shields, a psychological tactic meant to terrify the defenders. Graham stepped closer to Rowena. He didn't touch her, not in front of his men, but his sheer proximity was a grounding anchor. "Go down to the cellars," Graham ordered softly. "Stay with Vanya and the non-combatants. Lock the heavy iron grate. I need to coordinate the bucket brigades if they manage to throw fire over the walls," Rowena argued, her chin tilting up. "If the grain silos burn, winning this battle means nothing." "Rowena," Graham's voice dropped, shedding the tone of a king and adopting the desperate plea of a man. "If they breach the walls and Kaelan gets his hands on you, he will tear you apart just to break me. I cannot command a defense if I am looking over my shoulder to see if you are breathing. Go to the cellars." She looked into his amber eyes. The beast was surfacing, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the gold. He was preparing to shift. He was preparing to tear men to pieces. Rowena swallowed the bitter taste of fear in her mouth. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Do not die, Graham. The ledger cannot afford a royal funeral." A terrifying, wolfish grin split Graham's face. "Yes, my queen." Rowena turned and practically ran down the stone steps of the battlement. The keep was a hive of controlled, frantic energy. Blacksmiths hauled buckets of sand to extinguish fires. Sentries checked their bowstrings. Nobody looked hungry anymore. They looked feral. They looked ready. She reached the massive wooden doors of the keep, just as the first massive boom echoed through the courtyard. Kaelin's men had reached the outer gates. They were using a felled pine trunk as a battering ram. Rowena threw herself inside, rushing down the dark, spiraling stairs into the belly of Direholm. The cellars were packed. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and silent. The elderly sat on crates of salted pork, gripping crude daggers. Vanya stood by the locked iron grate, a massive battle-axe resting in her scarred hands. "Status?" Vanya barked as Rowena reached the bottom step. "They are at the gates," Rowena panted, leaning heavily against the damp stone wall. "Graham has them funneled into the courtyard approach." Above them, the world erupted. The heavy oak doors of the gatehouse splintered. Even through 50 feet of solid rock, Rowena heard the sickening crunch of wood giving way. Then came the screams. They were not human screams. They were the agonizing, guttural howls of werewolves, caught in Rowena's trap. Boiling oil rained down from the murder holes, instantly vaporizing the snow and melting flesh to the bone. The battle for Direholm had begun. For 2 hours Rowena sat in the suffocating dark of the cellar, listening to the muffled sounds of slaughter. She heard the distinct, deafening roar of Graham in his wolf form. She heard the clash of steel, the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the packed snow, and the frantic barking of orders. Every time a heavy crash shook the ceiling, dust rained down on her hair. She kept her eyes fixed on the flickering tallow candle sitting on a barrel of wheat. She counted the seconds. She calculated the burn rate of the oil. She ran the numbers, desperately trying to keep her mind from picturing Graham lying bleeding in the snow. Then, abruptly, the screaming stopped. The heavy metallic clash of swords faded. The only sound left was the howling of the winter wind rattling the high windows. The silence was infinitely worse than the noise. Rowena stood up, her legs stiff and shaking. She grabbed the iron bars of the cellar grate. Vanya stood beside her, her knuckles white around the handle of her axe. "Open it," Rowena whispered. Vanya hesitated. "Alpha gave strict orders." "I gave an order, Vanya. Unlock the gate." Vanya looked at the small, fragile human woman. She saw the absolute, terrifying resolve in her eyes. Without another word, Vanya pulled the heavy iron ring of keys from her belt and unlocked the grate. Rowena pushed past her, sprinting up the stone steps. Smoke choked the courtyard, thick and greasy. Rowena pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the keep, coughing into her sleeve. The scene before her was a chaotic, bloody nightmare. The snow was no longer white. It was a trampled, muddy canvas of crimson and black. Dozens of bodies littered the yard, twisted in unnatural angles. Arrows protruded from the joints of Kaelin's heavily armored men, exactly as Rowena had instructed. Direholm's defenders were battered, bleeding, but standing. Kael the blacksmith leaned heavily against a wall, tying a bloody rag around a gash on his thigh. Fen was wiping his blade clean on the cloak of a fallen enemy. Rowena's eyes darted frantically through the smoke, searching. In the center of the courtyard, 2 massive wolves circled each other. One was a heavy, muscular beast with a coat of dirty grey, Kaelin. He was limping, a deep claw mark weeping blood down his left flank. The other was a nightmare of midnight fur, Graham. He was covered in blood, though whether it was his own or his enemies, Rowena couldn't tell. The remaining fighters from both sides formed a loose ring around them. This was the old way, the absolute, undeniable law of the wolves. The packs would not fight to the last man if the alphas settled the dispute through single combat. Kaelin lunged, his jaws snapping for Graham's throat. Graham didn't retreat. He dropped his heavy shoulder, absorbing the impact, and spun. The speed was blinding. Before Kalen could recover his footing in the slick mud, Graham's jaws locked onto the grey wolf's front leg. The snap of the bone echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot. Kalen howled, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed sideways. He thrashed, trying to bring his snapping jaws up to defend himself, but Graham was already there. The black wolf planted a massive paw firmly on Kalen's chest, pinning him to the bloody snow. Graham's jaws hovered inches from Kalen's throat, exposing razor-sharp teeth. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from Graham's chest, shaking the very air. It was an offer of submission. Yield or die. Kalen froze. He looked up at the terrifying beast standing over him. The grey wolf whined, a high, pathetic sound, and exposed his neck. He yielded. Graham held the position for 3 long, agonizing seconds, ensuring every single surviving member of Kalen's pack saw their alpha break. Then Graham stepped back. The transformation was fast and sickeningly loud. Bones cracked and stitched together. Graham rose from the snow as a man. He stood completely naked, his chest heaving, steam rolling off his overheated skin into the freezing air. He was battered, covered in dark bruises and shallow cuts, but he was alive. Fen walked forward, throwing a heavy wool cloak over Graham's shoulders. Graham pulled the cloak tight and turned to face Kalen's surviving men. There were roughly 30 of them left, standing huddled together near the shattered gates. "Take your alpha," Graham commanded, his voice a hoarse, ragged scrape. "Carry him back over the ridge. If a single one of your boots touches my territory again, I will not offer quarter. I will slaughter you all." Kalen's men didn't argue. 2 of them rushed forward, dragging the shifting, groaning form of their defeated alpha toward the gates. The rest followed in a panicked, disorganized retreat. Graham watched them leave. When the last of them disappeared through the splintered archway, his shoulders slumped. The terrifying godlike aura of the alpha vanished, leaving only an exhausted, bleeding man. He turned around and saw Rowena standing on the keep steps. Graham didn't care about his bleeding men. He didn't care about the broken gates. He walked straight through the carnage, his heavy boots splashing in the muddy snow until he reached her. He stopped 1 step below her, looking up. His face was smeared with soot and blood. "You didn't stay in the cellar," he noted softly. "I don't like the dark," Rowena replied, her voice trembling slightly. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her acutely aware of the sheer brutality she had just witnessed. Graham reached out. He didn't grab her. He gently rested his bloody, battered forehead against her waist, burying his face in the thick wool of her dress. It was an act of complete, unguarded surrender. The King of the North, bowing to the Southern Ledger Keeper. Rowena's breath hitched. She raised her hands, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before burying her fingers in his dark, sweaty hair. She held him. She felt the heavy, ragged thud of his heart against her stomach. "We held the walls," Graham whispered into the fabric of her dress. "We did," Rowena agreed softly. Graham lifted his head. He looked into her eyes, his amber gaze intensely clear. "You saved my kingdom, Rowena. The oil, the archers. They broke themselves against your math before I even had to draw a sword. A transaction requires maintenance to ensure a return on investment," she whispered, falling back on her old defensive sarcasm. Graham smiled, reaching up to wipe a smudge of soot from her cheek. "I bought a bride to secure a border," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that vibrated straight through her chest. "I didn't expect her to rewrite the ledger of my entire life." Rowena didn't have a sarcastic reply for that. She didn't want one. She looked around the bloody, shattered courtyard. Men were limping, the gates were broken, and the winter was still painfully long. But there was food in the cellars, the enemy was broken, and the Alpha King was looking at her like she was the only fire left in the world. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. He tasted of blood, smoke, and victory. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest, completely unbothered by the cold or the watchful eyes of his pack. The southern girl who had arrived as collateral was dead. In her place stood the Queen of Direholm, an architect of ice and iron, ruling the only thing that mattered, the heart of the wolf. Did Rowena's defiance spark something in you? Surviving a world of starving wolves and brutal winters takes more than a sharp blade. It takes a sharper mind. Graham thought he bought a pawn, but he just handed his kingdom over to a queen who knows exactly how to play the game. If you want to see how Rowena brings this pack to heel and how Graham handles a woman who doesn't fear his claws, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe. Drop a comment below. Who do you think will break first, the king or the bride?